Well, hello, everybody. It's so nice to have you here with us today. I'm not seeing any of you except for Steve, but I know you're there, and I'm thrilled that you're joining me for today's Student Aid Index or SAI calculation. So we won't go too deep into the weeds, but this definitely does get a little bit weedier than we talk about sometimes. But in my opinion, understanding how the formula works, what it takes into account is incredibly important. So I think now that we have a new formula, a simpler formula, it's important to be able to, kind of see how that works. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the Student Aid Index has replaced the expected family contribution. So gone is the EFC, and here is the SAI. The methodology and formula that are used behind the scenes have also been updated. The SAI, of course, is determined by the information provided on the FAFSA. So one of the most basic questions that we get a lot is kind of like, how do schools determine what you're eligible for? So what schools do is they determine a student's need. And how schools determine need is the same at all schools. Basically, what they do is they take the SAI and they subtract that from the cost of attendance. So when we're looking at need, we can see that need varies tremendously depending on the school that students are attending. So the cost of attendance varies by school. So for example, we might have some low-cost schools, maybe our community colleges. We have some mid-cost schools. Sorry, I hit something and I backed myself up. We have some mid-cost schools, maybe our like state universities, and then we have some very high-cost schools out there. So you take the cost of the school. The SAI stays the same, right? The student aid index is the same regardless of which school the student is attending or looking to attend. So if we have a low cost school where the cost is 10,600, we subtract the SAI and that student has 7,600 in need at that particular school. At the mid-cost school, they're going to have more need. They're going to have need of about 23,500 because the cost is higher. And then at the highest cost school or higher cost school, you're still going to take that cost. Let's use 68,000 in this scenario. You're going to subtract that 3,000, and so they're going to have $65,000 in need. So that SAI is a critical component to determining need at every single school that a student would be looking at and potentially attending. One of the things that we want to convey to students as they're looking at schools is that even if they think they're not going to get financial aid because maybe their sibling went to a lower cost school and didn't get much financial aid, that we always want them to apply and go through the process because a student might not get a lot of financial aid at a low cost school, but could indeed get a significant amount of aid at a high cost school. So that's why we want everyone to apply, make sure they get their FAFSA done, get those financial aid offers so that we can see what they're actually eligible to receive. And as we know, sometimes the higher cost schools actually are the schools that have the best financial aid and can be more affordable sometimes than the lower cost schools. But the devil's in the details, right? And every school is going to be different. So when that SAI is calculated, it has to be used to determine eligibility for the following programs. So the SAI is used to determine eligibility for the federal Pell Grant. Now, at a later session today, we're going to go into more detail about Pell Grants. There are actually now multiple ways a person can be eligible for a Pell Grant, but the SAI calculation does remain one way in which a student can be eligible for a Pell Grant. The SAI is also used to determine eligibility for a subsidized Stafford loan or direct loan. The SAI is also used to determine eligibility for what we call campus-based programs. So a campus-based program would be a program where the school itself applies to get some money from the federal government. An example of this is the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. So I used to work at UMaine, and so we would get a lump sum of SEOG funding, and then it would be up to us to determine how to distribute that money within certain rules, okay? So campus-based means the school gets a lump sum of money and then they determine eligibility for it. But they still have to use the SAI in that SAI calculation when determining eligibility, and work study works the same ways. So Even at a school like a Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby that use the CSS profile, the SAI has to be used to determine eligibility for these funds. As we know, many schools also use the FAFSA and that SAI calculation to determine eligibility for other types of funding, including their own need-based institutional aid. So at all of the University of Maine system schools, they use that information to determine how they're going to award their need-based grants as well. So in the formulas that live behind the scenes, there are actually 3 SAI formulas. Formula A is used for dependent students. Formula B is used for independent students without dependents other than a spouse. And Formula C is for independent students with dependents other than a spouse. Okay. So there's 2 independent student formulas, and what it really comes down to, is do they have kids or not? And that makes the formulas are very different for independent students who have children or other dependents other than a spouse versus the ones that don't. For today, we're going to focus on dependent students, but the concepts are actually very similar. And in a moment, I'm going to show you the worksheets so that you can see where they live, what they look like, and you can see that there are formulas for all 3 of these scenarios. But before I show you the formulas, I wanted to touch on a few other things. And one of those is assets. We talk a lot about assets, and the fact, actually, most of the conversations around the fact that assets have very little impact on financial aid eligibility. For many families, assets have no impact on financial aid eligibility. So why is that? First of all, it's because assets are excluded for many students. So, for example, for dependent students, and there's similar thinking on the independent student side, any student that qualifies for a maximum Pell Grant, and again, in our session on Pels this afternoon, we're going to talk about what the criteria is to receive a maximum Pell Grant. But if a student qualifies for maximum Pell Grant, automatically no assets are taken into account. If an applicant's parents, we're talking about dependent students here, if an applicant's parents had an income in 2022, that's the year that this year's FAFSA is looking at, that was less than $60,000, and they did not file a Schedule A, B, D, E, F, or H, and they did not file a Schedule C, or they filed a Schedule C with a net income, business income that was less than or equal to 10,000 and greater than or equal to a negative 10,000. Okay, kind of getting in the weeds on that one. But basically, most families who earn less than 60,000 are not going to either have to provide assets, or even if assets are provided, they are excluded from the formula. So no assets impacting financial aid eligibility for those individuals. Additionally, if anyone in the applicant's family, so with the student, the parents, the siblings, anyone in the household is receiving benefits from any means-tested federal benefit program for this current FAFSA, either the 22 or the 23 calendar year, then they are not going to be required to provide any assets, or no assets will be calculated into the formula. So that means that's everything from main care to free and reduced lunch to housing subsidies to SNAP, TANF, WIC, all of those sorts of programs. And again, it's anyone in that family. Now, you'll notice a moment ago that I said that they won't be asked to provide assets, or even if assets are included, they won't be used. The reason that I'm saying it that way is because these means tested questions and the income are on the parent side. So if I have a student, just in case you're working with students, if I have a student who is filing a FAFSA, and they are starting the FAFSA, because remember, either the parent or the student can start the FAFSA. Let's say the student starts the FAFSA, the student is going to see those asset questions. Once the parent does their section, if the parent, let's say, says yes to one of those means tested questions, then the parent won't even be asked about assets. Students already provided them, but I want you to know that even though the student provided them, they will be excluded. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind with this new FAFSA and the roles-based form. Sometimes people might be like, well, I didn't think I was going to see those questions. They might still see them, but if at the end of the day, they're not required to contribute to the formula, then they will be excluded. All right, so we have the formula itself, and the formula has some tables in it. Um, so when I did this last week, we did it in person. So we provided people with packets. So you actually had a packet in front of you. That packet does live on that our website. So if you go to faymain.com slash FA101 under this session, you're going to see the packet that I'm going to show you in a moment. So there's actually two sets of PDFs out there. One is the formula itself, okay? The whole packet with all of the formulas. So I'm going to show you that in a moment. But then in the other packet, you're going to find the calculations I'm going to show you in a moment. And in doing those calculations, there are certain tables that we're referring to. So I just wanted to highlight which those tables were so that you could find them easily if you're looking at the whole big comprehensive packet. Okay, so let me do that very quickly. So I'm going to go here. And Steve, can you tell me if you're seeing the formula?
Oh, it's small. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger. I just
Is
formula.
someone
It's the
is
family of four slide.
no, it's not. It's the
No,
formula A. Okay, I'll stop.
no.
I'll stop and reshare. One of the things we are finding is that sometimes um, when we move to different screens, sometimes you go with us and sometimes you don't.
It
Okay,
doesn't.
so there, I think
There you
now you
go.
are seeing.
Okay.
Okay, okay.
Yep, got it.
So I wanted to show you, this is the formula. So this is, there's no mystery how an SAI is calculated. So I'm actually on page 12 here, but I'm going to quickly try not to make you dizzy, but I'm going to go to the top here. Okay. So this is the FAFSA Pell Eligibility and SAI Guide for 2024. So this is on our website. If you go to FA101, go to faymain.com/FA101, you will see this full formula guide. Now, again, I don't want to make you dizzy by going through it, okay, too quickly, but there's a bunch of stuff in here. It's 43 pages, okay? So it's going to give you all of the various formulas and all of these supporting tables. It's actually going to talk a lot about Pell Grant eligibility. But the key thing that we're going to focus on today, I just want to get there real quickly, is Formula A for dependent students, okay? So this is on page 12. You're going to find this formula. It's a two-page parents part, 2 pages for the student, and we're going to go through it together. And then it's followed by those critical tables. After you see those critical tables that we'll use in the calculation that I'm going to demonstrate in a moment, then you'll see Formula B for independent students without dependents other than a spouse. And then following that, you're going to see Formula C. Okay, so that full guide is available on our website. So if you want to do these calculations yourself, because we're going to focus on dependent students today, you want to do an independent one, that's where you can find that information. But for today, we are going to focus on a dependent student. So we have a dependent student. It's a family of 4. Mom, dad are 46. Max is 17. Chris is 13. I'll explain why in a moment. That is important. Mom and dad's financial information is that they filed taxes and they earned $80,000 combined. They had no other income or offsets. We can see what they paid for federal income tax. Max did indeed work himself and earned $4,000. But in this scenario, no one has any asset information. Okay. So next up, what we're going to do is we are going to go and do a calculation together. So bear with me. I know this changing of screens is not ideal. Hold on, that's not where I want it to be. But I just want to be, I think seeing it in action is the best way. Okay, almost there. Okay, there. I think we're good, Steve. I think people can see the calculation. So let me know.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So when we talk about an SAI, what we have is we have parent information, parent income information, parent asset information. We have student information. We have student income information, and we have student asset information. So for the purposes of this first one, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to show you again that family of four making $80,000. What does their SAI look like? How does it get calculated? What gets factored in? And at the end of the day, how much is their SAI? So we're going to start first of all on the parent side of things. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller just so we can see more of the page. But again, you've got this on the website, faymain.com/FA101. You have this packet there. So in this scenario, what gets taken into account? So on the parent income side, the biggest thing for most families is their adjusted gross income. So based on their tax return, it's going to pull over their adjusted gross income. In this case, it's 80,000. They eliminated for this year a lot of the other sources of income. So for example, in the past, as we'll see in a moment, they used to take into account contributions to a retirement plan if you made those pre-tax. So that used to be added in to people's income. That is no longer there. So there are a couple of other additions to income beyond just the AGI. There are things like deductible payments to a KEO, tax-exempt interest, rollovers or untaxed portions of rollovers and things like that for an income, but very, very few. For most families, what we're finding this year is that it's only their AGI is the only income that's taken into account. I actually want to point out something that was interesting to me the other day. I was looking at the formulas and I was looking at my niece in particular, and she's a freshman in college. So her SAI is significantly lower than her EFC was last year. I expected some of that, but it was lower than I thought it was going to be. So I reached out to my sister and I said, hey, can you share your tax returns with me, basically? Because we did the FAFSA together, but of course the information came over from the IRS and I couldn't see any of it. And what I learned was her husband, and I knew this, but her husband was on deployment. And so he's in the National Guard. So his income while he was on deployment, that income was untaxed. So their taxable income, their AGI, was much lower. The deployment income, that untaxed income, does not show up anywhere in this formula. So for this 1 year, even though their income was about the same from 21 to 22, because some of that income was due to his deployment that was untaxed, their SAI is very different than it would have been. So when we're talking with families, what types of income they have, taxable or untaxable, is making a big difference, much more so than it used to with the old formula. All right, so those are our income inputs. Then there are income offsets. So what this would be is, let's just say, for example, we have a parent who is in school themselves. Actually, I'm going to use this one. Let's just say we have a parent who is getting education tax credit. So when they file their taxes, their child has been in college for a few years and they get a tax credit. That tax credit, we don't want that to count against them, or the formula is designed so it doesn't count against them. So we can take that out, okay? Work study is a probably more obvious one. Think about it on the student side, because the same thing exists on the student side. If a student is working in a job that's a work study job, they have to report that income, that work study income, as regular income. So when they file their taxes, you will see that they will show the earnings from regular jobs and work study jobs will both be on their income tax return. But the way that this program is set up is we don't want federal work study to count against a student. So if I had a student on the student side who had income that was both a combination of work study and non-work study, here I would list the amount that was from work study, and that would be taken out. So it would not count against them. So that's what these offsets are. It's acknowledging that sometimes there's a program or something that's meant to be beneficial to the family, and we don't want it to count against them when the SAI is being calculated. Next, what we have are allowances against the parent income. So this is a big deal here. So basically, this is saying, okay, this family had $80,000 in income, but all $80,000 of that income is not available to them. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, they have to pay taxes. So it acknowledges that there are federal taxes that have to be paid. Here, what we basically have is that they have to pay Social Security tax. They have to pay the Medicare part of it, and they have to pay the old age survivors part of it. So basically, these are calculations that total up to 7.65%. So all of us see 7.65% of our income go to Social Security taxes. So the formula recognizes that. If you go look at those tables I showed you a moment ago, that's where it will show you what the calculations are, but they total 7.65%. So I took 80,000 and I multiplied it by those percentages. So that's how I came up with these numbers. Then there's something called the income protection allowance. This is what I was talking about in the first presentation when we talked about the fact that the FAFSA processing was delayed because they needed to update the tables. This is one of the tables that they updated. So basically, this table says that we're going to protect a portion of your income because, of course, you have to run your household. You have to, pay mortgage or rent. You have to heat. You have electricity. You have food. You have all of these things that you need to spend your money on. So the formula recognizes that and protects a portion of the income. One of the things that's better with this new formula is the income protection allowance is larger. It being larger is good because it means more income is protected. Okay, so those amounts have been bumped up. So for a family of four, this is why, it's important how many people are in the family. A family of four, you're going to see that the income protection allowance on the parent side is $42,430. There is also an allowance for the fact that it costs money to work. So now what you're going to see that if the parents have earnings from work, if they have an AGI, then they are going to receive basically an offset, an allowance for the fact that it does cost them some money to work. In this case, the formula takes into account or says that basically we're going to assume that $4,730 or so is what we're going to assume is not available from your income because you need that in order to work. It's going to offset your work earnings. Okay. So then we total those up. I wish the total was on the same page. So here's what the total of all of the allowances are, just over 59,000, okay? So the allowances again were the taxes paid, Social Security tax, the income protection allowance, and then the employment allowance. So that is where we total all of those up and we get 59,000, a little over, okay? So then we take the parent income, we subtract out the allowances, the protections for their income, and here is what's left, about 20,000. So that is the amount that we're not going to assume all of that's the SAI, don't panic, but that's the amount that's considered potentially available. Now, for the purposes of this one, we'll get to it in a moment, no assets for this family. Okay, so we're just going to skip over assets. So then we're going to come down to the bottom of the formula. And what you're going to see here is that we've taken the parent available income, which was that 20,000, no assets being added to that, no contribution from assets. And then there's this calculation called the parent adjusted available income calculation. And it's kind of a funky calculation. So I'm going to show it to you. So what I want you to hold in your head while we jump over to this other screen, this was easier to do in person with a handout when you could look at two things at once. But what I want you to keep in mind here is we have an available income of about 20,000. Okay. Now, I don't think you came with me, so I'm going to get to where I want to get to. And then I'm going to reshare my screen. So bear with me just a
Marla,
second.
we can see you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Okay, you can see
This
me.
time it followed.
Okay. Yeah, this is why it's so hard because sometimes it follows and sometimes it doesn't. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out the pattern. Okay, so first of all, this is that income protection allowance. I just wanted you to see that. So a family of four, it's 42,000. Family of six, it's 58,000. Okay, so that's an important table just to keep in mind. But this is that funky calculation at the end, okay? So remember, our family with 80,000 has 20,000 of available income. So the final step in calculating that parent piece is we come over here and the parent's AAI falls into this bucket here. It was a little over 20,000, okay? So we say, okay, the SAI is 4532 plus 25% of the AAI that was over this amount, okay? Now, hopefully I'm going to go right back and you're going to see this. Did you just go with me again? Are you seeing the handwritten worksheet now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, super. A little clunky, I know, but here again, we had that 20,000. So we saw that we do the 4532 plus 25% of the amount that was over the 20,000 or whatever. So then it was an additional 12. Okay. So basically this says that the initial contribution from parents is 4544, not the initial. This is the contribution from parents. Okay. So parent earning about 80,000, family of 4, their SAI is 4,544. Any questions about that? And please speak up. I mean, this is a meeting, not a webinar. So you can unmute yourself and chat if you have a question. Hearing none, I'm going to continue on. Okay, so set parent stuff aside for a moment. So now we've got max, okay? And so this is the student contribution from income. It is exactly the same for the most part, okay? So we have the student income. In this case, there's no other income. He just has his earnings from work. There are no offsets, but keep in mind, if 2,000 of Max's income was from work study, then we would list work study here, which would mean that the amount of income that we would be looking at in terms of the SAI calculation would be down to 2,000, okay? We take the 4,000, we'd subtract out the 2,000 that was from work study, and it would only be 2,000, okay? But Max didn't have a work study job, so his full 4,000 is coming all the way down. We don't have any offsets against his income here. But we do have allowances. So just like on the parent side, there are allowances, although they're calculated slightly differently. In Max's case, earning $4,000, he didn't owe any federal income tax, so that's zero. He still, like everybody, has to pay his Social Security tax of 7.65%. So these two numbers, if you add them up, if you take 4,000 minus 7.645, whatever I just said, that's going to be broken down into these two. Okay, so this is Social Security tax. Students across the board, dependent students, have an income protection allowance as well, and it's $11,130. So see what this is going to do in just a moment. If parents' income was negative, that would be taken into account. That's not the scenario here. So what I'm going to do is take all of his allowances. So no taxes, no income taxes, but we do have Social Security tax, and we have his income protection allowance. So that totals 11,436. So we're going to take his income minus his allowances. Watch this. That's a negative number. Okay. So we're going to maintain that it's a negative number. It may be a negative number, and that's going to be beneficial to the student. We then take that and we multiply that point by 0.5, half a percentage. Okay. So we divide that in half. So we still have a negative number. And now our negative number is 3,718. But if I come over here and I read the instructions, if the negative is greater than 1,500, I'm going to set it to negative 1,500. Okay. So I have taken this number and I've made it the negative 1,500. The student doesn't have any assets. We're going to do a scenario where they do. So then how I calculate the student portion and the final calculation is I take the parent contribution that we just calculated a moment ago, 4,544. I'm going to subtract or add, but it's a negative number, so I'm subtracting the student contribution. So I'm taking the student contribution, which can be up to a negative 1,500 or could be a positive number, but in this case is a negative. No student contribution from assets. And so here is the final SAI for this student. So something that's very different with this formula is, first of all, we're having much higher income protection allowance tables, but also the student income is negative. So it is reducing the total SAI. So last year and next year, so this is a one-year thing, the students would never be a negative. So the parent income, the parent contribution was what it was. It wouldn't come down any lower than the parent contribution. But now the student contribution can bring down that total contribution if indeed it is a negative number. With that income protection allowance of 11,000, a whole bunch of our students are having a negative. So what we're seeing this year is the parent contribution is dropping once we take into account the student contribution. So I hope that makes sense. So we'll do a few more examples. If it doesn't, speak up and let me know. Okay, so what I wanted to show you next is I'm going to switch back, bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare, get back to my presentation. Okay. So what we just saw was that the SAI in that scenario was 3,044. Now, I just wanted to briefly mention the fact that when we talked about it in the opening session, that we did those income protection allowances were increased, and we're all frustrated that there was that delay in FAFSA processing. But this is how much of a difference it made. The parents' income protection allowance before the update for inflation was 35,000 for a family of 4. And now it's 42. So basically, that's a significant amount of income that's now being protected. The student income protection allowance before those tables were updated was 9,410. And of course, now, as we just talked about, it's 11,130. So basically, had they not updated those tables, that same family with that same information would have had an SAI of 5,446, where now it's 3,044. So frustrating that the delay happened, but beneficial for the student because this directly increases the difference between these numbers is the additional amount of Pell Grant eligibility that the student has. So that part is a good thing.
I sent it to you.
Okay, so next, what I wanted to show you just again briefly is I'm going to flip back over to this screen. Okay, did you guys go with me and are you seeing the EFC formula for 24-25? Or do I need to reshare?
We do not see it.
Okay, I'm going to reshare it then. I'll give you $10 if someone can tell me when it changes. I mean, why it does when it does. Okay. All right. So really quickly, I just wanted to highlight last year's formula. So this is the EFC formula. Same exact scenario. So that we have a family earning 80,000. Again, you're going to see here that they had their income, but look here, they had taxable and untaxed income. So any untaxed income did have to get listed, whether that was a contribution to a retirement plan or other types of untaxed income. So not having untaxed income in the formula anymore is really helping out families in some cases who do have untaxed income. Again, lots of times putting that into a retirement plan. The reason that they did it, to my understanding, is they basically wanted the formula to be simple and they wanted to use information that was already available from the IRS. They did not want to have to ask people about all sorts of other types of income. So basically they said, we're just going to take what's on the tax return. So that's why that untaxed income, which would only show up on a W-2, is not being required in the new formula anymore. So same sort of thing. You had your income, you had your offsets, you had your allowances. Previously, you had a state tax allowance. We did lose that. I was worried that that would negatively impact eligibility. But again, they increased the income protection allowance by so much that it totally offset that. So you can see last year, the income protection allowance for a family of 4 was only 32,000. So it's up to 42,000. So 10,000 more dollars are being protected for a family of 4, which is a lot of the reason why we're going to see lower SAIs this year. There was still the offset for an employment allowance, but it was only in a 2-parent family. It was only if both parents worked outside the home. So basically, the rest of the calculation was very similar. You had that available income. They did the crazy calculation. They did used to divide by the number in college. And as we've talked about, that's no longer the case. So there is no longer a division by the number in college. So those are a couple of the things that are the most significant differences from last year's formula to this year's formula. Um, on the student side, again, very similar. You'll notice last year the income protection allowance was only $7,600. So again, it's up over $11,000 now. So students can work a lot more and not have that impact their financial aid eligibility. And then, of course, last year, what was the case was there was no negative. So the lowest a student's SAI could be, or contribution from income, excuse me, would be 0. So there was no scenario under which the total SAI ended up being, or the total EFC ended up being less than the parent EFC. Okay. All right. Now let's go back here. So what I wanted to show you now is I wanted to talk a little bit about, and just make sure that you can see, you should now be seeing the PowerPoint presentation.
Hasn't come up. Hasn't
Okay.
come up.
All right, let's do it one more time. You could put this in the evaluation that this was clunky, and I'll take it. I'll take it, you guys. I'm sorry.
You're
Trying
not
to make it as
alone.
smooth as possible, but I recognize this is not as smooth as it is in person. Okay, now I think you're seeing impact from assets, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to do here is I wanted to provide some information, because I know one of the things that we worry about a lot is people thinking that if they save for higher education, that that's a bad thing, and it's going to negatively impact their financial aid eligibility. So we could certainly walk through all the calculations, and they are in the packet, but I'm not going to put you through that. I just wanted to kind of summarize the impact of assets. So we're back to the new formula. We're back to the SAI formula. And what I want you to know is that when we talk about parent assets, I have a scenario here where I have a family that is earning $100,000. Okay. So this is a higher earning family. And this family has an SAI of 9,311. So again, if you want to walk through in the packet that's on our website, you can see how that family of 4 with $100,000 in earning has an SAI of $9,311 when they have no assets. I'm still getting my head adjusted to this. A family that's earning $100,000 is eligible for Maine State Grant this year. Again, the details matter, but in many, many cases. So that, I think, is just speaking to how much SAIs are lower than EFCs were. But what I want to do here is I want to say, okay, but what if this family had assets? Is having assets going to really have an impact? So on the asset side, anything that's an asset is looked at the same way. So whether it's cash, savings, checking, whether it's a 529 plan, whether it is a business investment, whether it's a second property, all assets are looked at the same way. So basically, there's not a distinction between liquid assets and non-liquid assets, which I know can be frustrating to people. Okay. So all assets are looked at the same. But let's just say this family had assets of $10,000. Is it going to, and their income's high enough, so their assets are going to count. They don't receive any federally means tested benefits. So their SAI is going to go up, but it's only going to go up by $480. Probably not going to change their financial aid eligibility at all. Okay. Not even going to take them out of Maine State Grant eligibility. Now, if they had $25,000 in assets, okay, yes, their SAI is going to go up. It's going to go up by about $1,200. But they've got $25,000 in assets compared to someone who doesn't have any. Let's just say that someone has $50,000 in assets. Their SAI is going to go up by $2,486. So yes, is that going to start to have a little bit of impact on eligibility? Again, depending on where they fall already. Yeah, it could. On the other hand, there are going to be scenarios where it might make no impact to their financial aid eligibility. Depends on the school they're going to and all of that. If they're out of school, for example, where this would not change what they actually received that dramatically, $2,400 difference in the SAI, maybe between, a 15,000 and a 17,000 or 18,000 SAI probably is not going to change eligibility for aid for a lot of students. But this family has $50,000 of assets to tap into. They have so many more options available to them. And even if all of that 50,000 is not available to help pay for school, which probably it's not, having those options, whether it's the ability to make a payment plan, whether it's the ability to take out some cash and make a direct payment, whether it's the ability to borrow other money and have the criteria to be able to get approved for a loan. All of those things are really, really impactful. So we want families to know that saving is a really, really good thing, and it is not going to undermine financial aid eligibility to any large extent for most families, okay? All those caveats, I know. But again, under 60,000, no assets typically. Federally means tested benefits, no assets. And then once you get to this point, assets do have a little bit of an impact. Now, this year, there is always something in the form called an asset protection allowance. So just like we have an income protection allowance, there's an asset protection allowance. This year, the asset protection allowance is actually zero. There's a complicated way they figure it out. I couldn't even begin to explain it. But this year, there is no protection on the parent side for assets, but normally there is. So in many years, the first $5,000 or $10,000 of assets would actually be protected, meaning that they would actually have no impact. So again, you can look through the formula. You can see what it looks like this year. It does get updated every year. So we want to acknowledge that yes, SAIs are slightly impacted in some cases by savings, but the message that we really want to send is people are so much better off if they are able to have some savings, because the options that provides them and the fact that maybe they don't have to borrow loans or as much in loans is really going to be impactful in a positive way down the road. Now, student assets do have a little bit more impact. So whenever students' savings can be saved in a way that they count as a parent asset, like I've mentioned here in the note, if that money's put into a 529, that's going to be a good thing. So if a student has no assets, obviously no impact, but students' assets are assessed at a 20% rate. So for students with $3,000 in assets, that's going to increase their SAI by $600. Now, if they already had a negative, maybe all it's going to do is bring it up to a positive, okay? Assets at 5,000, it's going to increase the SAI by 1,000, and $10,000 in assets, again, the 2,000. So the student assets do count more. Parent assets are never more than 5.64%. Usually it's more like 2 to 3%. Students are going to be assessed at a 20% rate. If they have to provide assets, though, because keep in mind, if anyone in their family participates in any of those means tested benefits, it means that student assets are going to be completely ignored. So again, if families can save so that they these assets on the student side are counted as a parent asset, that's going to be a good thing. So whenever money is in a 529, let's just say the parent owns it and the student's the beneficiary, that gets counted as a parent asset. To be honest with you, even if the student was 18, they owned the 529 themselves, they owned it and they were the beneficiary, it would still count as a parent asset. So this is one way to save without having as much of an impact on financial aid eligibility. And another change for this year is that if a parent has multiple kids, so let's say when my oldest Alex was in school, and we were doing his FAFSA, Noah was still in high school. Both of my kids had a 529. When I filled out Alex's FAFSA, we had to list the total amount of assets in both accounts. Those rules changed this year. So what happened this year is that if I were doing a FAFSA for Alex, it was still that time frame, I would only have to list the amount in Alex's account. I wouldn't have to list the value of the assets in Noah's account. So it's only for the student that FAFSA is being completed for. Okay, not their siblings. So that's another good change. And then just because it comes up, if the 529 account or these other accounts are in someone else's name, like a grandparent, that is not going to have any impact at all, because grandparent assets, of course, don't show up on the FAFSA. and where contributions or impacts from grandparents owning a 529 used to show up is there used to be a question on the FAFSA that asked if anyone was helping contribute to the support of that student. So what people were supposed to do was if a grandparent gave a student money that had been in a 529 to help pay for their education, the student was supposed to count that as untaxed income. Again, untaxed income's gone. So if someone else outside the family owns it, it doesn't show up at all as the formula currently works. In the last 2 or 3 minutes here, I just wanted to share kind of like a few other tidbits, I called them, because I thought these were helpful and interesting. So there is no cutoff, like there never has been. Sometimes people would say, well, you know, if you earn over this amount or that amount, you shouldn't bother to apply, or you won't be eligible for a Pell Grant. Well, it's never been quite that hard and fast. But there are some general things I think we can keep in mind. So there's no parent income cutoff in terms of a Pell Grant, but families of 4 earning under 55,000 are likely to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, okay? Not just Pell Grant eligible, likely to be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant. And we'll dig into that a little bit more in the next session, okay? That will remain the case even next year without the negative student contribution, okay? So those families under 55,000 likely to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, and we're seeing families into the $80,000 range that are eligible for some amount of Pell Grant, even higher in certain circumstances. So when we talk about the fact that, you know, everything that's going on, it's been a little frustrating, underlying many of these changes was the fact that the desire was to have Pell Grant eligibility increased, and that has absolutely happened. So we're going to see that positive benefit when financial aid offers start rolling out. So it's for the students, once they earn over about 8,000 is when they lose that negative offset. So, you know, if you're saying to a student, you know, how much can you earn or whatever, because you know how sometimes students will say, well, you know, I don't want to work too much because it might negatively impact my financial aid eligibility. Really, I don't see those students very often, but every now and then. Right now, if students earn over 8,000, that's when their negative becomes a positive. But this is the more important one, that for students who, it's once they earn over about 12,000, that they will have a positive student contribution from income, okay? So the takeaway is that students can earn up to about $12,000 before there's any impact from their earnings on their SAI, okay? So they can earn up to about 12,000 before there's any impact on their financial aid eligibility. In some scenarios, even a little bit more. Okay, so I think that's good news. I think that's good news that more families are eligible, that the SAIs are lower in general, and that students can, you know, who need to work, and many of them are working so hard that that's not negatively impacting them. All right. Any questions? And again, thank you guys for hanging in with me on that one. A little bit bumpier than I meant for it to be, but I hope you got a takeaway of what is in the formula, what counts, how this year's formula is different from next year's formula, and things of that nature. Any questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask away. And I will show you at the risk of screen sharing one more time. I'm going to do it though. Okay. So I want you to see that, not that one. I wanted you to see where on our website. Yeah, okay. I'm glad someone's asking a question. Steve, if you want to go ahead and let me know what that question is.
Yeah, it's about the links to the afternoon session. I'll take care of it.
Okay, great, great. So let's go here. Okay. All right. So hopefully you're seeing the FA 101 page. So if you scroll down here, you're going to see the session here. And here's where you can see the full handout with all of the formulas and all of the worksheets. Or this is, excuse me, this is the one that I did the calculations on, and here's the full handout, okay? So if you wanted to see what I showed you on the screen, plus a little bit more, that's where you can find them. and everything is being recorded today, and the recording will be added here as well. I'm going to stop recording.